Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's jump into today's episode. Let's talk about body language. It's really important to come across in a way where your presence shows confidence and authority. There was a wonderful research study done by a gentleman named Albert Mehrabian, who wrote a book called Silent Messages. And at the time, what his study revealed, and when I say at the time, this was back in 1967, but the numbers keep getting replicated today. And he wanted to find out what and how you basically how you come across through your body language when presenting, but also how you sound with your voice and the message itself. So essentially, there are three items that he realized were always at play when we're communicating any message. One is the visual, what people see of you. Number two is the vocal, how you sound with your voice. And number three is what you're actually saying, the message itself. We'll take a minute to think which holds the most weight. In your mind, which do you think holds the most credibility to other people? Again, visual, how you look, not your slides or any visual aids, but truly how you come across. And then the second one is the voice. And the third is the message. All right, drum roll, please. Feel free to pause if you'd like to think about this and guess, but here are the numbers. The numbers are 55% is visual, 38% is vocal, and only a whopping 7% is the message itself. Now, I do want to explain what these numbers don't mean. They don't mean that only 7% of what you say matters. But when there is an inconsistency between what we're saying and how we're coming across when we're saying it, then people will only remember 7% of the message. So here's the deal. We've got to make sure that we are coming across visually in the best way possible. And it starts with posture. So the first thing I want to talk about is making sure that you have your shoulders back. Think about expansion. Too often as women, we have been culturally conditioned to make ourselves physically smaller. And this needs to stop. We have been conditioned to keep our hands in front of us, to cross our legs, to sit politely, however you would define that. But ultimately, that is how we've been conditioned. So this is really important to be a model for other women. And ultimately, so that you can come across as more credible and influential. But having those shoulders back is a great place to start. And then when you're standing, so that's the other thing. We want to talk about when we're seated and when we're standing. When we're standing, you want to have that strong posture and make sure that your weight is evenly distributed on both feet. This is a problem that a lot of people have as they lean on one leg. And there have been some really interesting studies done, and one in particular, informally, I will say, I have tested this out in front of groups myself, where I model myself as two different people. One person standing on one leg, leaning, and then the other person standing solidly on both legs. And the question that's fun to ask is, which one of these people is reporting to the other? And the person with the leg slanted, leaning on one leg is always the one that people say, oh, that person's reporting to the other. So the one with that strong posture is the one that looks the most confident. So this is really key to keep in mind, starting with that powerful stance. And when you're seated, making sure that you are sitting a little bit on the, like your bum a little bit toward the front of the chair. And leaning in physically will show that you're engaged. The other thing that you want to think about is hand gestures. And that is not something I should say it's not something we think about very often, but this is also the question that most people ask me. What do I do with my hands? So let's start with when you're seated. So let's imagine you're seated, you're leaning forward. And now this is, by the way, primarily when you're speaking. You can relax a little bit when you are not speaking. But I do want to say something quickly here about relaxing when you're not speaking. Part of the problem with us keeping the habits engaged in a good, like basically good habits when we're public speaking is that we don't think about them at times other than when we're speaking. And we have to change that mindset. We have to remember that every time we open up our mouths is an opportunity to influence and an opportunity for people to decide if they think that we're credible or not. And that's why thinking about these habits in any part of your life can be helpful. So, for example, let's say that you are waiting in line at the post office. See if you can stand there with your hands at your sides to practice that. Practice standing with your weight evenly distributed on both feet and not leaning on one leg. When you do this and you incorporate these habits into other parts of your lives, then when you really need this, or your other parts of your life, when you really need this, then it won't be so hard to bring these habits forth because they will already be ingrained in you. That muscle memory will be there. So, thinking back now to when you're seated, you're leaning in. That's where you want to make sure first that you don't have your hands under the table. You want your hands to be on top of the table. And I find that when I have my hands or my wrists rather lightly rested on the table, then I look relaxed, but they're also readily available for me to use them to speak. You don't want to have them gripping the table with nervousness, but a simple light touch on the table will be great. I will always remember when I was doing a training at AT&T and T, and my hands, or excuse me, not me. When I was doing a training at AT&T, the head executive wanted to introduce me. So I said, "Great." And she asked me, which was amazing. I've never had any executive that wanted to introduce me ask me this. She said, "Will you record me so I can watch it after?" And I said, "Absolutely." And it was so great that we did that because she, first of all, had a very naturally gregarious personality, wonderful voice, very lots of energy in her hand gestures. And her hands, at first, when she introduced me, seated, were rapidly firing great gestures, but under the table. It looked weird. It looked like she was trapped. And she was also a petite woman. But then about halfway through, she got more comfortable, obviously, because then suddenly her hands came above the table and it was a completely different experience. So remember to have your hands above the table, lightly rested on the table. And again, recommend putting your wrists lightly rested, and that will make them available. What you don't want to do, I will say, please never do this. Never have your hands clasped together or holding them together in front of your body. Because when we hold our hands in front of our body, it's a protective measure and it looks like we're unapproachable. And so having them open will make you come across as more inviting, more open, more approachable, and simply a more likable person because it doesn't look like we're hiding something. I had a client who said, "I have to get my hands to break up with each other, but they keep wanting to get back together." So keep your hands broken up with each other. And that can be a great place to start, especially when you're nervous about what you're actually presenting. Doing your best to unclasp your hands, keep them apart, and make sure that you don't have them in front of you. And one thing you want to avoid is the fig leaf. This is when you're standing up and you have your hands clasped together, but all the way down, basically in front of your vulnerable areas where your crotch meets your legs. And we call this the fig leaf. The fig leaf is one of the most passive postures that you could have. So many people stand like this, but you will stand out if you have your hands rested at your sides when you're not using them. So if you're standing somewhere, that's why I always say if you're at a post office or at a cafe or somewhere where you're waiting, use that as a time to see if you can see what it feels like to put your hands at your sides. It will probably feel really awkward at first, but what I want to tell you is that it doesn't look awkward. And that is from thousands of hours of experience, thousands of clients over the last 20 years. That is very important to keep in mind that there is a big disparity between how we think we come across versus how we actually come across. And it can be very different. We can feel, for example, like we're, it's not that big of a deal with our hands or that we're using bigger gestures than we actually are. And that's why recording ourselves is so important because when you record yourself and you watch it back, you're able to see the difference. That's why it was so cool when I recorded that woman from AT&T, because after she spoke later that day, I sat down and watched that with her, and it made a difference. She was able to see. She thought, "Wow, I didn't think it was that big of a deal that my hands were under the table, but I see how different it is." That is very important to have that open posture. Oh dear, hold please. What is that? The other thing about what not to do is hold a little purse in front of you. It's a little challenging because I know most of you are listening to this, but for those of you on video, you can see that I'm just holding my hands in front of me, clutching my hands together. And that looks so passive. And it just looks weird when our hands are way up in front of our chest and we're holding our hands in front of us. So again, remember, keep that open posture. The other thing to keep in mind is is happening with our head. And this may sound a little bit strange, but most women tilt their heads to the side. Now, here's what's interesting. You can opt to have it and be aware of it and hold your head specifically straight above your spine. This does sound sort of strange. But the interesting thing that research shows is that when our head tilts and our neck is open, it comes across as if we're more open. So I actually think that this is a strength. You don't want to be tilting back and forth like a head bob because that's also obviously not good. But a little tilt sometimes can show openness. Now, when you combine that with leaning in, smiling, having your eyebrows raised a little bit, that all comes across as really inviting. Those are important small things that seem sort of unusual to talk about, but all of these things are nuances, and that's what's also really important to remember is that all of these things add up. All of these nuances add up to an impression that a person is left with, and they're left with deciding, do I think this person is trustworthy or not? Do I think they're credible or not? Do I think they're likable or not? And all of this combines. And when we think about these things, I would also tell you, think about it as one step at a time. Don't try to practice them all at once. But with the smile, having a lightness to your expression makes all the difference. It's so fascinating. And some of you know the story of when I was first starting out as a corporate trainer. I studied really long and hard, and I was at this monumental moment where I was sitting there in front of my boss, and I had to present the material to see if I could present in front of clients. So after we finished, I really felt confident about it. And she asked me, "How do you think it went?" And I said, "I think I nailed it." And she said, "Well, if I really listen, your content was practically perfect. But Karen, you looked pissed off the entire time." And I thought, "What? What? Wait a second." I couldn't believe it. And then I saw the video. Thank God she recorded me because I couldn't believe how serious I looked. And what I have now learned over all of these years is that when people are thinking about their content, they get this furrowed brow above their face. They get very serious. And it's kind of like the RBF resting bee face. We want to avoid that whenever possible because it puts off our audience. And I learned a valuable lesson that day that you cannot sacrifice connection for perfection. I'll say that again because I really love this reminder. You cannot sacrifice connection for perfection. And I'm guessing that there are a lot of perfectionists listening to this right now. But we have to remember people are not paying that much attention to us. I hate to say it. When we're presenting, when we're speaking, we are competing with attention spans and so many other things going on in people's minds. So we have to remember that we've got only, we've got to remember that it's not like they are dying on our every word. So remembering to have that smile, that lightness, people are going to listen to what we say based on how engaging we are. And if we go back to that Albert Mehrabian study, 55% of how we come across is in how we physically look. What is the visual and how we're coming across? The other thing I wanted to mention is have a strong handshake, but not too strong. Most women, well, let's put it this way. Let's take that part out. Doesn't really matter about most women. Let's eliminate that, Danny. When you're shaking someone's hand, make sure that you look them in the eye and you shake their hand. You want to have a firm handshake, not a hand crushing handshake. But I have found that more often than not, I get a limp handshake rather than a overly strong handshake. The key here is practice this with people. Practice that handshake. Is it strong? Does it come across as a confident person? And that is huge related to body language, related to first impressions. The other one is thinking about scenarios. Let's imagine that you are speaking on a panel and you've got stools there, or even if you're seated and there's nothing in front of you. Do your best. First of all, I always recommend, I personally am not a big fan of skirts or dresses. Personally, I think they look fabulous. I've never felt super confident in a dress. But when you're on a panel, make sure that you ask in advance, what is the chair situation going to be like? Because if you typically wear dresses, you want to make sure that people aren't looking up your skirt or you're making it possible for that. And then they're distracting. That's distracting. You want to do the least distracting thing. And most of the time, having your legs together with your ankles crossed is the easiest thing to do as far as the posture goes when you don't have something in front of you. Otherwise, if you have a table in front of you or something like that, it's great for you to be able to have both feet touching the ground. And when you also don't have anything in front of you and you're not speaking, have your hands lightly rested on your lap. This is another good time to practice not having your hands clasped. Now, again, when you're not speaking, it's not as big of a deal. So while other people, for example, on the panel are speaking, you can have your hands lightly rested in front of you. But if you can practice when you're not speaking and you can practice having your hands separated, that will help that muscle memory to be at the ready for when you need it, as opposed to then speaking and your home base being hands clasped. Your home base ideally would be your hands lightly rested. So one hand on each leg, not having your hands together. That would be the ideal posture. The other thing you want to be careful of with your hands is not to point at people. Always have an open hand. Think about it as your palms up rather than palms down. That will help you to create the most inviting thing. And especially if you've got slides that you're presenting from, you can use your hand. This is also a great way to expand your gestures beyond your waist. That is something that I didn't say yet, is making sure that you get some variety in your gestures so that your elbows aren't stuck to your body. You want to make sure that your elbows expand a little bit occasionally. And that's a great way to do it, is to outstretch your arm with an open hand to a flip chart or to a slide or something. It's also a great thing when you're comparing before and after. Like, let's say you said something like, if you outstretch your right arm to say where we were in Q1, and then your other arm could outstretch to the side and say where we're going in Q2. That is a wonderful opportunity where your content would match the gestures that you have. Because let's face it, that's what you want to do. You want your content should be illuminated by the gestures that you have. Natural gestures, again, just like you would with your friends at a barbecue or when you're talking without even thinking about what you're saying. That's when you're going to come across with the most natural persona of yourself. Well, I look forward to hearing feedback on this episode. If you have any questions, I would love to hear more. What do you want to know related to body language? What questions do you have? Anything that comes to mind where you say, oh, I'd really love to know the answer to that. I would love to be able to help you. And as a reminder, I am always looking for opportunities to speak in organizations, can be for men and women, but as you know, I specialize in women. But please let me know if you have any connections and you would like to introduce me to somebody. I am readily available and would love to connect. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.